Many people also think that this kind of relief is only eligible for women. It's not. It's also eligible for men. My name is John Lawit. Today we're going to talk about the Violence Against Women Act, or as it's otherwise known as a VAWA. VAWA applies to both men and women. In order to qualify for this type of humanitarian relief, you have to have been married to a lawful permanent resident or a U.S. citizen. During the course of your marriage to the citizen or permanent resident, you experienced domestic violence, other kinds of intimidation. The violence can be psychological, and it is a complex process where you must prepare documentation of the violence and abuse that you had suffered. This could include medical reports. It could include counseling that you received by a religious person of your faith, or counseling you received from a marriage counselor or a psychologist. It also can include your own sworn statement. If the violence was such that the police were called, you can use police reports to also show and demonstrate the abuse in order to qualify under this particular part of the law. The other thing that you can show is psychological abuse. Many people who get married to permanent residents or citizens, thinking that they're going to have a normal married life, come to the U.S. only to find out that the person who petitioned for them is trying to extort money from them, trying to turn them into slaves by making them work and do other things for the spouse under threat of not cooperating with USCIS and perfecting their immigrant status. USCIS has determined that threats about not filing applications or threats to turn a person into USCIS for removal, this kind of psychological abuse also qualifies you for VAWA. There are more subtle kinds of psychological abuse that would qualify a person for VAWA, say by contacting family members at home in your home country and telling them that you are going to be deported from the United States, or that you're a bad spouse, or other kinds of information that would result in a tremendous hardship to you as a result of this abuse. It happens all the time. Many people who come to the United States and file for permanent residence first must qualify for conditional permanent residence. To qualify for conditional permanent residence, there's usually an interview that is held where the evidence is examined by a USCIS officer to determine whether or not the marriage is valid. In a lot of cases, the abuser begins to expect money payments from the spouse in order to even go to the interview. Sometimes they go to the interview because they know that once the conditional residence status is granted, the individual will have to go to work because they're going to try to extort money from the immigrant in order to go through the final stage of the process. If the abuser refuses to go through the final stage of the process to remove the conditional permanent resident status and conditions their cooperation upon the spouse doing or not doing a particular act, that is a form of abuse. Now, of course, physical abuse is easier to document, but many people who have been abused physically are afraid to go to the police and make a complaint. In fact, they're afraid to talk to anybody. In many cases, as a result of physical abuse, men and women have to go to shelters that are set up for victims of domestic violence. Many people also think that this kind of relief is only eligible for women. It's not. It's also eligible for men. Men can also apply for protection under the Violence for Women Act. There are U.S. citizen and permanent resident women who abuse their male spouses in order to control them or to get money from them, but have no intention of carrying on a normal marriage. While these other cases have not come up, certainly threatening to out somebody because of their sexuality, or to tell USCIS that the person is a transgender individual, this also can be a form of abuse because it makes the person who otherwise would be eligible for permanent residence to be afraid, and to be afraid to talk to anybody about the threats that the person has made. The violence and threats can also manifest themselves in things that happen to family members outside of the country as a result of what the U.S. citizen or permanent resident tells those family members, or tells their own family members to go and see the family members abroad to try to get them to pay money. This law is very generous, and it also allows for self-petitions. You don't have to continue to be married to the person in order to file for protection under VAWA. Many individuals have been forced to leave their spouse, and then they petition for themselves to apply for VAWA. The key is the evidence. It's not enough to just say I was abused. There must be evidence of the abuse. Aside from the ones that I've already mentioned, pictures of black and blue marks on a person's body, for example, other evidence of abuse, black eyes, red marks on the body. These are all evidence that can be used to demonstrate physical abuse that occurred. The psychological abuse is much more difficult. And it's very important that if you're undergoing psychological abuse, first that you receive help, but more importantly, that you talk to people about the psychological abuse and how it's affecting you. Make no mistake about this. Domestic violence often leads to death. It's very important that if you're being abused, that you get out of that situation as quickly as possible. Abusers, particularly those abusers who are violent, often escalate the abuse to control the person, and in many cases, the person dies. I cannot overemphasize how dangerous domestic violence is. And fortunately, the U.S. immigration laws do recognize how dangerous this is and allow for otherwise law-abiding people who got involved with U.S. citizens or permanent residents who were violent like this. It allows them to have protection. The psychological abuse, of course, is much more subtle, and it will require extensive documentation, not only to demonstrate that the psychological abuse has occurred, but that it's in general a reoccurring problem and not a one-time event. And the evidence of the psychological abuse is most often comes in the form of conversations that a person has had with either a medical provider or even a close friend that they've confided in. All this evidence is gathered up and the VAWA application is filed. If the VAWA application is granted, the person can proceed on to a permanent residence. This statute also applies to children of abuse whose parent have been abused. The children can also benefit. In many cases, the U.S. citizen or permanent resident actually doesn't abuse the adult spouse, but actually takes it out on the children. And in many cases threatens to have the children taken away from the parents, threatens to call the state on the parent because they're not taking care of their children, and otherwise tortures their spouse by threatening the children. This is also a form of abuse that the statute recognizes. And if any of these situations are occurring in your life, you must, first of all, protect yourself and remove yourself from the situation, and then make the application to USCIS so that you can remain in the United States and continue on and become a permanent resident.